The morning of my brother's wedding, I wore a gray dress I'd bought at a department store 2 years earlier. Nothing special. Nothing that announced anything. That was intentional. I stood at the edge of the parking lot of St. Slaughter, Ambrose Church, and Carmel, Indiana, watching guests file in through the heavy oak doors, and I remember thinking, just get through today. Just be quiet, be small. Take up as little space as possible, and let your brother have his day. I had been telling myself that for most of my adult life. I spotted my mother near the entrance, standing next to my Aunt Carol, both of them in coordinated blush pink. My mother had always had a talent for coordination, for appearances. She saw me from about 30 feet away, and for a moment her expression didn't change at all. Then she gave me a small, tight smile, the kind you give a stranger who holds the door for you, and turned back to my aunt. That was my welcome home. I hadn't been back to Indiana in 14 months, not since Christmas of the year before, when my father had told me, over a dinner table of 7 people, that I was still drifting and that it was honestly embarrassing at this point. I was 31 years old. I had smiled and passed the rolls and excused myself to the bathroom where I sat on the edge of the tub for 10 minutes with my hands folded in my lap. I was used to it. That's the part that is hard to explain to people who didn't grow up in a family like mine. You don't get outraged every time. After a while, it just feels like weather. You dress for it. You brace. You wait for it to pass. My brother Daniel was getting married to a woman named Heather, who was perfectly nice and had glossy hair and laughed at everything my father said. They had been together for 3 years. The wedding had 140 guests, a string quartet for the ceremony, and a reception venue with a vineyard view. My parents had paid for most of it. I had been invited, technically. My name was on the envelope, but I understood, the way you understand things in families like mine, that my invitation was a formality, a box checked. I was invited the way you invite a distant cousin you haven't seen in a decade, out of obligation, not desire. My father hadn't spoken to me directly in almost 8 months, not since I'd declined to come home for Easter, not since the phone call where he'd told me I had no sense of responsibility and I had, for the first time in my life, not disagreed with him. Inside the church, I took a seat in the back left pew, 3rd row from the last. I told myself that was practical, easier to leave quietly and not what it actually was, which was self-protection. If you sit in the back, you can see everything before it reaches you. The ceremony was beautiful, honestly. The string quartet played something I didn't recognize, but that made the older women in the row ahead of me reach for their purses for tissues. Daniel looked genuinely happy. He was 28, 4 years younger than me, and he had always been the one who knew what he wanted. Business degree, the right internships, the right job, the right girl. He moved through life the way my father moved through a room, with a kind of assumed welcome, a certainty that space would be made for him. I used to envy that. I don't think I do anymore. The ceremony lasted 40 minutes. I stayed in my seat while the other guests filed out, letting the crowd thin, not in any rush. An older woman I didn't recognize gave me a smile as she passed. I smiled back. Then I heard my father's voice. He was maybe 15 feet away near the side aisle, talking to my Uncle Robert. He hadn't seen me yet. I watched him for a moment, silver-haired now, fuller in the face than I remembered, still carrying himself with that particular ease of a man who has never once doubted that the world was organized in his favor. He laughed at something my uncle said, and it was the same laugh I'd heard my whole childhood. Big, filling the room, expecting to be received. I stood up. I thought, I will walk to the reception. I will find a seat far from the family table. I will eat whatever chicken dish they're serving, and I will hug Daniel and Heather and leave before dessert. That was the plan. That was the entire plan. Is that my father stopped mid-sentence. He had seen me. For a moment, I thought it would be fine. I thought he would nod, maybe the way you nod at something you've acknowledged and decided not to engage with. I even took a half-step toward him out of something that, God help me, still wanted to be recognized. "What are you doing here?" He said it quietly, but with a particular sharpness that my body still recognized before my mind did. My Uncle Robert looked at the floor. I was invited, I said. I came for Daniel. I know you were invited. He said it like the invitation had been a mistake. I mean, what are you doing standing around? The guests are moving to the reception. I was just waiting for the crowd to thin out. He looked at me for a moment, and I saw something in his expression that was harder than anger. It was a kind of impatience, like I was a problem he'd hoped time would solve, and here I was again, unsolved. Your mother and I would appreciate, he said, if you kept a low profile today. This is about Daniel and Heather, not about you. I know that. Good. He straightened the front of his jacket. Try to remember it. He turned back to my uncle, and the conversation resumed, and I stood there for approximately 3 seconds before I started moving toward the door. I have thought about those 3 seconds many times since, what I felt in them. It wasn't fury, which surprises people when I describe it. It was something quieter and more corrosive. It was the feeling of being confirmed, of having suspected something about yourself for so long that when someone finally says it out loud, there's almost a terrible relief in it. He still thought I was nothing. He had always thought I was nothing. That part, at least, was settled. The reception was at a vineyard venue called Bellhaven Estates, about 12 minutes from the church. I drove myself. I had a rental car, one of those mid-sized sedans that feel like temporary life, and I sat in it for a few minutes in the parking lot before going in. I texted my friend Priya. He did the thing again. I'm fine. Don't let me call you crying in a vineyard bathroom later. She texted back. You are not fine, but also you are and. Also call me from the vineyard bathroom. I literally have nothing going on. I laughed. Actually laughed. Alone in a rental car in Indiana. Priya has that effect. Inside, the venue was everything my mother would have designed if given unlimited access to a Pinterest board. Soft white linens, candles and glass cylinders, flowers that looked expensive in that way where the expense is in the restraint. I found my seat card near the back, naturally at a table with 2 of Daniel's college friends I didn't know and a great aunt who had once told me she admired my interesting choices with the emphasis of someone who found them uninteresting. I sat down. I drank a glass of water. I watched the wedding party arrive to applause and thought about Daniel's face during the ceremony, how he'd looked at Heather when she came down the aisle. That part had been real. Whatever else was complicated, that part had been real, and it mattered. The toasts were long. My father's was the longest. He spoke about Daniel's work ethic, his discipline, his clear-eyed vision for his future. He said Daniel had always known who he was, and he said it with a particular weight that I understood was not just praise for Daniel. He made his points with his eyes, my father. He always had. I kept my face still and clapped when everyone else clapped. The meal arrived. The chicken dish was, in fact, quite good. I talked to one of Daniel's college friends, a guy named Marcus who was funny and worked in urban planning and had opinions about highway design that were more interesting than that sounds. I felt myself relax, slightly. I was going to survive this. Then Daniel's new father-in-law made his way to our table. I had met him briefly once, at a dinner the year before. Heather's father, a man named Gerald Whitmore, retired now, in his late 60s, white-haired, straight-backed. He'd been polite at that dinner, forgettable, I'd thought, in the way of men who have learned to observe more than they speak. He came up to our table apparently to say hello to one of the other guests he knew, and then his eyes landed on me and something shifted in his expression. Not dramatically. Just shifted. "Excuse me," he said, and he said it to the table, but he was looking at me. "I'm sorry to interrupt. He tilted his head slightly the way people do when they're working something out. "I'm Gerald Whitmore. I don't know if you remember me." "I do," I said. "We met at Fiore last spring. I'm Claire, Daniel's sister." "Yes," he said slowly. And you work for... Forgive me. I want to make sure I have this right. Are you with the U.S. Attorney's Office in the Southern District of New York?" The table went quiet in that particular way where everyone pretends they aren't listening. "I am," I said. Gerald Whitmore straightened almost imperceptibly. The way a person does when something they've been told doesn't match what they're observing. I thought so, he said. I recognized you from the case. I was a federal magistrate for 22 years. I followed the Rendon prosecution very closely. He paused. You were lead counsel. I heard Marcus, next to me, set down his fork. I said. That was Gerald shook his head once. That was an extraordinary piece of litigation. I've talked about that case in every legal ethics conversation I've had in the last 2 years. The complexity of the evidence framework alone. He looked at me steadily. How old are you, if you don't mind my asking? 32. He nodded. Heather told me her future sister-in-law was a lawyer but didn't say much else. He said it without criticism, just observation. I wish I had known earlier. I would have liked to have had a proper conversation. There's still time, I said. He smiled. A real one. There is. Yes. Will you excuse me one moment? He moved away from the table, and I sat very still. Marcus leaned over. Led counsel on the Rendon case, he said in a low voice. That was like national news. That was the financial fraud thing that took down. Yes, I said. That was you. That was our team. He sat back in his chair. I need to update my entire understanding of this table. I smiled and reached for my water glass and did not let myself look toward the family table across the room. I did not let myself look, but I knew, with the certainty that settled in my chest like something finally going still, that Gerald Whitmore would not stay quiet. Men like him, men who have spent decades in courtrooms, do not acquire information of significance and sit on it. It is not in their nature. I was right. I didn't see exactly what happened. I was talking to Marcus, genuinely talking now, about his highway project, when I heard the change in register from the family table. My mother's voice, bright with the particular brightness of social recovery. My father's voice underneath it saying something I couldn't make out. It was my brother who came to find me. Daniel crossed the room with the careful, deliberate walk of a man navigating something he hadn't anticipated on his wedding day. He stopped at my chair and I looked up at him, and his expression was complicated in a way I hadn't seen on him since we were children. He had our mother's coloring and our father's jaw and an expression right now that belonged entirely to himself. Hey, he said. Hey, I kept my voice easy. It's a beautiful wedding. Heather looks incredible. He sat down in the empty chair next to me that Marcus had vacated to get another drink. Gerald just talked to Dad. Okay. Claire. He said my name the way people say it when they want you to slow down. Why didn't you ever say anything? I thought about that question. I had been thinking about some version of it for years. You know how it is with Dad, I said finally. If you tell him you're trying, he turns it into a referendum on why you haven't succeeded yet. And if you succeed, he finds the angle where it isn't quite enough. How you folded my napkin in my lap. So I stopped reporting in. I stopped giving him the chance. Daniel was quiet. I'm not angry, I said, and I meant it mostly. I came today because you're my brother, and I love you and I wanted to see you get married. That's true. He wants to talk to you. I know. What are you going to do? I looked across the room. My father was standing near the family table now, and he was looking at me with an expression I had never seen on him before. It was not an easy expression to categorize. It had embarrassment in it. It had something that might have been confusion. It had, at the edges, the beginning of something that looked like it cost him. I had waited for that expression for a long time. I want to be honest about that. Some part of me had imagined it, in the way you imagine things when you're in a car alone or lying awake at 3 a.m. The moment of recognition. The moment it registered that I was not who he'd decided I was. And now it was here. And I felt, not the relief I'd expected. Not the satisfaction. Something more complicated and quieter. Something that understood that a look across a vineyard reception hall, however long overdue, was not the same as the years it had replaced. I'll talk to him, I said, but not today. Daniel looked at me. Today is your wedding day, I said. He can wait one day. He can sit with it for one day, and then I'll talk to him. I reached over and put my hand briefly on my brother's forearm. Go back to your wife. He looked at me for a long moment. He was doing the calculation that children of difficult parents learn to do, the one where you weigh what someone deserves against what the moment can hold. Then he nodded. He stood. He put his hand on my shoulder for just a moment, the way he used to when we were kids and something had gone wrong and he didn't know what to say, and then he walked back. I turned toward the window. The vineyard rows were lit from below, amber light running down the lines of the trellises in the early evening dark. It was genuinely beautiful. The kind of thing you can appreciate when you stop trying to monitor every corner of the room. Gerald Whitmore came back to the table a few minutes later and sat down, and we talked for an hour about federal prosecution strategy, about the evolution of financial crime, about a case from his tenure that had fascinated him and that I'd studied in law school. He was sharp and generous in that way of people who have nothing left to prove. I was glad to talk to him. I was glad to be there. My father did not approach me that night. He looked at me twice more from across the room, both times with that same new expression that I had no clean word for. Both times I held his gaze for a moment and then looked away, not in retreat, but in the measured way of someone who has learned to decide what they engage with and when. I left before dessert. I had said I would. Daniel hugged me at the door, a real hug, and whispered something that I won't write here because it belongs to the two of us. Heather hugged me too and said she hoped I'd come back to visit, and I think she meant it. Gerald Whitmore shook my hand with both of his and said he'd be following my career, and I told him the feeling was mutual. My mother caught me near the exit. She looked at me with an expression that was trying, visibly trying, to rearrange itself into something warmer than what it had been that morning in the church parking lot. I didn't know, she said. I know you didn't. You could have told us. I picked up my coat from the rack by the door. I tried a few times. It didn't go the way I'd hoped. I kept my voice even. We can talk about it, but not tonight. She blinked. She was not accustomed to being offered a rain check by me. Okay, she said finally. Quietly. I walked out. The night air was cool and smelled like turned earth and something green, the way rural Indiana smells in May before everything gets heavy with summer. I found my rental car and stood next to it for a moment without getting in. Above the vineyard, the sky had that clear, dense darkness you only get outside of cities, more stars than seem necessary. I called Priya from the parking lot. She answered on the second ring. Vineyard bathroom, she said. Parking lot, actually. No tears. Progress. His new father-in-law knew the Rendon case, I said. There was a pause. Gerald Whitmore, she said. The federal magistrate, the same. Oh, she said. Then oh, she said. Then oh, my father's face, I said. I don't even have the words. Do you feel good? She asked. Not asking if I'd won, not asking if I'd been vindicated. Just good. The way someone who actually knows you asks. I thought about it. The way you think about something when you want to be truthful and not just reactive. I don't know yet, I said. I feel real. I feel like I took up the right amount of space today. I leaned against the car. That's something. That's everything, Priya said. I drove back to my hotel with the windows down. The road was straight and dark and flat in the way of Midwestern roads, the kind that feel like they're asking you to think. I had a flight back to New York in the morning. I had a case filing on Monday and a meeting with my supervisor on Tuesday, and a life that was full and hard and mine in every way that mattered. My father called 3 days later. I let it go to voicemail. He said he'd like to talk when I had a chance, that he'd been doing some thinking, that he wanted to understand. I listened to it twice. I didn't call back that day, or the next. On the fourth day, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee and called him back. Not because the recognition had fixed anything. Not because one conversation from Gerald Whitmore had undone 32 years of being looked through. But because I had meant what I said to my brother about being willing to talk. And I try to mean the things I say. My father answered on the first ring. I said, I have about 45 minutes before I need to be somewhere, but I'm here. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, that's enough. I'll take it. It wasn't a resolution. It was the beginning of something harder and slower and less cinematic than a revelation at a wedding reception. But it was honest, and I have learned, over the years, to prefer honest over clean. I took a sip of my coffee. Outside my window, the city was doing what it always does. Unceasing, indifferent, absolutely full of life. I started talking. There's a version of this story where I walk out of that vineyard and feel triumphant, where the look on my father's face is the ending, the payoff, the thing that makes everything else worth it. I understand why people want that version. I wanted it too, for a long time. But what I've come to understand, slowly and not without resistance, is that the moment that changed things wasn't Gerald Whitmore saying my name across a reception hall. It was every morning I got up and went to work anyway. Every filing deadline I met when I was exhausted. Every time I chose to stay in the room, professionally and personally, when leaving would have been easier. The recognition didn't create who I was. I had already become her. The recognition just made it harder for certain people to keep pretending otherwise. That's the part that doesn't fit neatly into a story, the years before the moment. The grinding, unglamorous accumulation of choices that nobody witnesses. I didn't become lead counsel on a federal prosecution because I was trying to prove something to my father. I became it because I cared deeply about the work, because I was willing to fail at it repeatedly until I wasn't, because the law, the actual substance of it, the precision it demands, the way it forces you to think through consequences, genuinely mattered to me. The work was its own reason. What I've learned is that when you build something real, built on actual effort and actual skill, you don't need to announce it. You don't need to manage how people see you. Reality has its own weight. It lands on its own. Gerald Whitmore didn't need me to tell him who I was. He already knew, because the work existed in the world independent of whatever story my family had been telling about me for years. And here's what I think about the harder question. The one that TP3.U25 asked in a comment that I read weeks later and couldn't stop thinking about. What if I hadn't succeeded? What if I had actually been the person my father decided I was? Would I have deserved love then? The answer is yes, unambiguously. A parent's love that requires a federal prosecution to activate is not a foundation. It is a transaction. I say this without bitterness now. Though it took time to get there. What I want, if there is someone reading this who is still in the years before their moment, still in the accumulation phase, still doing the work in rooms nobody is watching, is for you to hear this clearly. Your value is not pending. It is not waiting to be confirmed by someone who withheld it. The work you do in private, the integrity you maintain when there is no audience for it, the way you keep going when keeping going is the only available option. That is the whole thing. That is character. And character, unlike recognition, cannot be taken from you. I called my father back on the 4th day. Not because he had earned it, but because I had decided who I wanted to be in that relationship going forward, and it was someone who showed up with honesty even when it wasn't easy. That's not forgiveness on a timeline. That's just the kind of person I'm choosing to become. It's a daily choice. Some days it's harder than others. The vineyard was beautiful. The stars were extraordinary. I drove home with the windows down and the night asked nothing of me. And I was, for the first time in a long time, exactly enough.